In the late 50s, history would be made with this screen right here. Right here is believed to be one of the earliest examples of a video game, which was brought to life by physicist William Higginbotham, who used an analog computer to program it. While the computer's initial purpose was to create ways to simulate the trajectory of a moving object, like a bouncing ball for example, Higginbotham decided to create a tennis game out of it for the Brookhaven's National Laboratories Visitors Day that they had every year to liven up the place. Little did he know this would end up launching a whole new area of media that would thrive for decades to come. It used to be crazy for me to fathom how something so simple could be so important for its later counterparts. It's a show of how far people are able to take their creative process and make something amazing out of it. Now, given this is a dinosaur media channel, in case you couldn't tell, it would be far from a surprise if I told you those were pretty much my exact thoughts when I learned about the earliest known dinosaur games. The game's popularity for the Brookhaven's laboratory would bring in a line that would go straight out the door. Because so many people wanted to play this tennis game, and as computer technology increased and eventually the invention of home consoles came into the spotlight, the spread of video games would create a whole new industry by the time the 70s hit. Pong, Death Race, Space Invaders, and Asteroids are just a few examples of the popular games that gave rise throughout this point in time. But the first dinosaur games wouldn't appear until the early 80s. Maybe the technology was not quite there yet in the 70s to bring dinosaurs into a more interactive world, but in the 80s, people were graced with things like 1981's 3D Monster Maze, one of, if not the first survival horror games ever made, and 1983's BC's Quest for Tires, a caveman side-scroller game. And while these games were definitely one of the earliest of their kind, there is another game that came out slightly earlier that could very well hold the title of being the first dinosaur game ever created, and that game is 1981's Dino Wars. As I was researching for this video, one of the titles that I ran into was 1981's Dino Wars. It's a very simple side-scrolling fighting game. There's not much to it, but that's to be expected since video games at this point in time were still very limited compared to how they are now. Regardless, the game's simplicity would only be a stepping stone in the titles people would eventually come to know and love. Dino Wars is a very early example of a fighting game. The game was specifically made to be a two-player game, and the objective was simple. You and your opponent fight until one of you runs out of health. The game features two tyrannosaurs, one red and one blue, and you attack by biting each other until someone wins. What's funny about this part of the game are the sound effects. When you bite each other, the tyrannosaurs sound like this. Apparently, there's a story to this. During my research for Dino Wars and any behind-the-scenes information on it, there was one site that I ran into, and I believe is called Nitrous9, that talked about the sound effects for the game because, let's be honest, that's probably the most interesting thing about Dino Wars. According to the article, there was a 2013 interview of the game's author, Robert G. Kilgus, where he states the sound effects were recordings of his wife, Peggy Yvonne Kilgus, roaring into a microphone, where he would then pitch it to sound like a heavier, somewhat dinosaur-like roar. According to Kilgus, that led to a very interesting week or so of strange sounds coming from the open windows of the Kilgus house one summer. I would hand the microphone to Peggy and start my recording utility. Peggy would roar into the microphone. I would then spend a lot of time isolating the roar and playing it back with a variety of parameters. Sometimes the results were quite funny. Peggy's roar might sound like a small dog's yapping bark, or it might sound like a whale's deep bellow. In between, there might be something that could be described as the growl of a bear, or even a dinosaur's roar. And of course, we were also searching for the sound of a dinosaur yelping in pain from a bite. Many of the unexpected results were followed by the two of us laughing our heads off. I always wondered what our neighbors thought was going on in our house that summer. When the fight ends, the loser Tyrannosaurus runs away in the distance, you know, like a little bitch, while the winner stays and revels in all its glory. Again, a very simple game, very crude in comparison to how they would come to be even after the following decade, but one cool feature that it has is that the dinosaurs are in a 3D environment, as they are able to move back from and forward to the screen during the game, but as expected, there's not much to this since the map is pretty empty aside from a few random cactuses, which can hurt you if you run into them. Another very random feature that I found out about is that you're able to change the color of the map by pressing C. Holy shit, that is so innovative! The game was originally programmed in 1980 and fully released in cartridge format in August of 1981 by Tandy Corporation / Radio Shack, an electronics company that specialized mainly in computers during this point in time. The first one, I believe, being the TRS-80 color computer, which is the platform that Dino Wars was released on. This specific platform supported 2 controllers, therefore the game was made around that feature, allowing 2 players to fight at the same time. Going back to the game's author, who I mentioned earlier was Robert G. Kilgus, he was known for his other games during this point in time like Skiing, Color Cubes, Quasar Commander, all for Tandy Corporation. As far as the game's development or backstory goes, there's also not much about it that I can find around the internet, which again is to be expected. Not only is the game old, but it was probably not trying to be anything revolutionary or big. This was during the tail end of the golden age of arcade gaming, so maybe by this point people were just throwing things out there to see what would stick without giving it a second thought. Who knows? At least that's what I thought at first. But I wasn't completely satisfied with this answer, so I attempted to contact the game's creator, Robert G. Kilgus, in the hopes that he could give me more information about this game. In my search to contact Kilgus, I was directed to a person named L. Curtis Boyle, who is actually the one behind the article from Nitrous 9, and has had contact with Kilgus before, and he was nice enough to send my questions his way. Keep in mind, because this game was made over 40 years ago, there's not a lot of certainty with the answers to my questions. One of my questions was, why dinosaurs? Out of anything you could have based a 2-player fighting game on, why was it dinosaurs? Was there even really a reason for it, or was it more of a random choice? Kilgus didn't remember the specific reason why dinosaurs were chosen for the game, but he does say that given the difficulty regarding the scaling of the character's position in-game, coupled with the constraints of working with early computers that had limited memory and low resolution, the characters being humans or any kind of modern animal would have required too much detail, whereas dinosaurs were pretty simple and distinct enough to work with. In regards to the game's development time, Kilgus confirms that most of these color computer games took him around 6 weeks to complete, from coming up with the concept of the game to finishing up all the code for it. He received feedback mainly in the context of improving the game before release, but when it came to the reception from the general audience, Kilgus never received any feedback from them, so he didn't really know the kind of reception his game had at that time. Though Boyle did clarify in the email that from his own observations, the game was loved by many of the younger demographics, with the only people tearing it apart being cynical adults. Sounds about right. Anyways, thank you so much to L. Curtis Boyle and Robert Kilgus for helping me out and providing me with all of this information. Looking around the internet, you'll see that some accounts will regard 3D Monster Maze as the first survival horror game ever created. What's very interesting about this game is that its main antagonist is a T-Rex of all things. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because I already made a full-on video talking about the game's history and premise, so if you want a more detailed account of that, check out my previous video on it. But since we're on the topic of the earliest dinosaur games, I'd be remiss to not at least mention it here. The story of the game is that you're visiting a carnival and run into a clown that introduces you to a new attraction, a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Entering the attraction means entering its lair, and you can do so at your own risk. Next thing you know, you're thrown into a maze where you're now being hunted by a hungry T-Rex. At this point, the goal is to try to survive the dinosaur as you try and find the exit. The game may look simple here, but back when it was first made, the horror scene in games were new and simple, so the standards for what qualified as scary in a game were different. But even today, you could argue the game's horror could still put someone on edge, since it may not be the game itself that's scary, but just the idea that something is after you in a limited space. The game was developed in the UK by Malcolm Evans on a ZX81 for the purpose of testing out the computer's capabilities. Sometime after, he would meet a man named J.K. Gray, who had his own software company, where they would release Evans' game from on December 1st, 1981. What resulted was a massive success. The game would make good sales and be praised for its innovation, as a 3D game of this degree, as well as being one of the earliest to be sold on home consoles, was not very common. And I don't think I mentioned it in my previous video on the topic, but the coding development behind 3D Monster Maze is actually pretty cool. I was able to find a page that gives a rundown on how Evans went about creating the game. The game is a mixture of basic and machine coding, of which basic was primarily used. I know nothing of programming, but from my surface level research, it seems that basic coding, which stands for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, is more for general use and is picked over other coding methods due to how easy it can be learned, and machine coding is a programming language that's made up of binary numbers which can be used to create instructions for the CPU to follow. Machine coding was only used for speed in Monster Maze, whereas basic coding took care of the rest. In regards to the game's map, the maze is actually made up of 18 by 16 squares and looks something like this. Every path is always just one square wide, and every step you take counts as one square. The way the Rex moves around the map is based on two set priorities, of which it chooses one randomly for every move. Set 1 is west, east, south, then north, and set 2 is south, north, west, then east. No matter what set it picks though, the dinosaur's goal is always the same, to get closer to the player. That being said, the breakdown of the game does mention that this can result in the Rex getting stuck in the corner, making it so it can't get the player at all, but this doesn't mean you're able to locate the Rex if this does happen, because the only appearance of the Rex that was ever created was when it came after you from the front. Trying to find it in a different angle isn't possible because it was never designed to be seen from other angles. In fact, the Rex is only comprised of 10 frames of animation, all of which are used for when it approaches you head on. Very cool breakdown on the game. If you guys want to learn more about it, I'll leave a link to the breakdown in the description down below. So this one might not even really count, since the one dinosaur that's in this game is only really a factor of the very minor story that takes place for BC's quest for tires, rather than actually being a part of the gameplay in any way, but whatever, I'm still going to include it because it was one of the earliest games to at least feature a dinosaur. BC's Quest for Tires is a 1983 side-scroller adventure game that's centered around a caveman riding on a stone wheel on his way to rescue a cave woman who simply goes by Cute Chick in the game, who had been kidnapped by a dinosaur. The objective is to dodge obstacles and make your way to the dinosaur's lair to save the girl. For the time, the game was very fast-paced, and as you progress through the map, you encounter different challenges and obstacles. BC's Quest for Tires is actually based off of the comic strip by John Hart that also goes by BC, and the caveman that you see riding on the stone tire in the game is actually supposed to be Thor, a character that shows up in the comic strip. What's even funnier about this is that, based on his character description, Thor touts himself as a ladies' man and the inventor of the wheel. Cute Chick is actually the name of one of the characters that also features in the comic from time to time, along with Fat Broad, who's also in the game, who tries to hit you off your wheel as you have to jump over some turtles to get past a pond. What's also cool about this game is that the cover art was done by Hart as well. The story behind the game's creation starts in the early 80s from one Michael Bate, a former pedal steel guitarist and radio host who would become well known locally in Ottawa, Canada for his passion of arcade games. In fact, this passion would end up landing him in a position with the Nabu Network, which was a part of the bigger Nabu company that were working to launch a very early version of a smart TV, being described as the first cable-based microcomputer-operated home computer network. Basically, with the proper Nabu equipment, people at home could install games and applications from a closed network onto their TVs, and the Nabu company wanted someone at the helm to create games for this new experience, so they enlisted Bate to be the head of the Nabu Games division. Bate wanted to find something that was recognizable and fitting for the campaign, and he eventually would after running into one of John Hart's BC comic strips from the newspaper. He got in contact with Hart, and him and the Nabu company talked to the comic writer about licensing his characters for a video game adaptation. They would come to an agreement, with Hart getting $25,000 a year for the rights to his BC characters. And soon, BC's Quest for Tires was born, but this game was only ever meant to be for the Nabu network. When the release of home consoles would blow up around this time, Bait was advocating for the game to be released in cartridge format, but Nabu was only interested in their own products, rather than diving more into the game industry. So with that, Bait and the game division for Nabu went independent for it, and they managed to get the game developed for home consoles while still working for Nabu in developing their specific products. As far as the game's development goes, it was designed and programmed by several people between its many releases, like Rick Banks, Charles Benton, Mary Lou O'Rourke, and Michael Davies. The initial development for the home console versions came from the software and computer game company Sydney Development Corporation, and it was published by Sierra Online Incorporated. It was released on multiple platforms, including Commodore 64, Apple II, Atari 8-bit, MSX, and more. Like the rest of the games in this video, BC's Quest for Tires is very simple. It doesn't take very long to complete, the objective is very straightforward, even the dinosaur content in the game doesn't go beyond this brontosaur dinosaur thing with its shit-eating grin, and this small little bird dude that helps you get over a gorge. Despite its simplicity, it's considered to be the first runner platform game, or the earliest known precursor of the endless runner games that would eventually overtake the mobile game market in the 2010s. But that's not the only accolade it's known for. The game would actually go on to win several awards as well, including the Critics' Choice Award for Best Game for Youngsters by Family Computing, the Archie Award for Most Humorous Game/Computer Game by Electronic Games. It would win the award as ColecoVision Game of the Year from Video Game Update, and for Best Use of Graphics and Sound in a Video Game from the Billboard magazine. With this success, the game would go on to get a sequel called BC2: Grog's Revenge in 1984. But by 1985, everything pretty much slowed down on all fronts. Bait would leave the game industry to do other stuff, and the Nabu, from my understanding, didn't work out, because from the sounds of it, it was too ahead of its time and people didn't really understand the tech that they were trying to offer. And while the BC game is a bit obscure today, those that do remember it can at least thank it for the runner games that we have now. You know, things like Tall Man Run and Sandwich Runner and Juice Run. And there you have it, the earliest dinosaur games ever created. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. This specific one I thought about doing, I'm not even joking, like over a year ago. I don't know why it took me this long to finally get to it. I guess for me to really put in the work for these videos, I have to want to cover it. Sometimes when I have an idea for a video, I don't always get to it right away because even though I think it's a good idea at that moment, I'm not immediately ready to cover that idea. If I force myself to do video topics that I don't really want to do in that moment, it results in a lazy video and, you know, burnout. That's another big thing, and I'd like to avoid both of those. But yeah, that's it for now. If there's any early dinosaur games that I missed, do let me know in the comments down below. I could maybe make a follow-up one of these days. I know there's more dinosaur games around this point in time, so it would be cool to talk about those as well. But that's all I have to say for now. Thank you all so much for watching, and please, have a nice day.